So this week, we are going to change units and move from learning about the 13 British colonies to now we're going to talk about how those colonies would begin the quest for their own independence from Great Britain and would eventually become the United States of America. So this Prezi is going to look at the causes of the American Revolution. What were some of the bad decisions that the British made that eventually caused the Americans or the British colonists to revolt and seek their own independence? So the first thing we need to do is we need to talk about what life was like in the Americas after the French and Indian War. And we'll look specifically at some of the people. We'll look at some of the people that lived in the British colonies, and they formed something called a social hierarchy. And so you see here that I have a triangle on this slide to kind of give you an idea of the percentages of people. There was a clear social hierarchy, and so at the top of the triangle you had your wealthy people. They ranked at the very, very top. There were many people kind of in the middle area, and those would have been the craftsmen like blacksmiths and silversmiths and the farmers that were able to maintain a living. And then as you got closer to the bottom, a larger amount of people were poor whites and indentured servants. And they were able to kind of maybe survive, maybe make a living, but they were just struggling to survive. The Native Americans and slaves would have been at the very bottom of the triangle, and they were obviously treated very poorly. It's important to note that during this time, it took about 6 weeks to take a voyage from the Great Britain to the colonies or from the colonies back to Great Britain. It took about 6 weeks to get a message back and forth on a ship. And so sometimes some of these things were happening, and it took a month and a half before the colonies knew that the British had passed one of these taxes, or it took a month and a half before the British knew that the colonists were really, really upset with one of these taxes. And so we'll look at that a little bit more specifically. Another thing to take note of, and that's really important, is the British really looked at the colonists as rednecks. And that's why I have a picture of Uncle Si here, because the British looked at the colonists as if they were backwards and they were hillbillies or rednecks. So, bad British decision number one actually happens at the very end of the French and Indian War. Pontiac's rebellion, remember the French lose the French and Indian War and they go home. And so all of this area out here, British colonists start to flood across the Appalachian Mountains and into the Ohio River Valley and the Tennessee River Valley, and they start to settle there. Well, as they start to settle there, there are lots of Native Americans there, and conflict comes after that. And the British king is forced to pay soldiers to protect colonists out here in this area. And frankly, he doesn't want to do that. And so the British king issues the Proclamation of 1763, in which he makes a deal with the Native Americans and says, Native Americans, you can stay here, and British colonists, you have to stay here, east of the Appalachian Mountains. The colonists are super mad about this because they had just fought a war with France, the French and Indian War, for 9 years in order to be able to gain this area. They won the war, and now the king was saying they couldn't have the area that they were fighting for in the first place. So they became very furious with the king, and they started to call themselves Americans for the very first time. So bad British decision number two comes 2 years later. And bad British decision number two is the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act was a tax that the British put on legal documents like licenses, newspapers, pamphlets, even playing cards. The problem with this, the mistake that the British made with this tax, is the two groups of people that were most affected by this were the two groups of people that could have the most influence with the colonists, and those were lawyers and newspaper writers. When this tax happened, those two groups were affected the most, and they got really mad. And so they were able to start rallying people to protest the Stamp Act, and eventually the Stamp Act gets overturned. One other thing happens as a result of the Stamp Act is that the Sons of Liberty, a kind of radical group that wanted independence from Great Britain, and they used sometimes violent measures like burning the governor's house down or tar and feathering someone. This group was started by Sam Adams in Boston. Bad British decision number 3 comes 2 years later. So the Stamp Act is 1765, and all of the uproar gets the Stamp Act repealed. It takes about a year, and the Stamp Act is repealed. But about a year later, the king still is trying to recuperate some of the money he spent for the French and Indian War, and so he decides to put another tax on the colonists in the Americas. This time, the tax is called the Townsend Acts, and the Townsend Acts are like they're like the Stamp Act on steroids, so to speak, because the Townsend Acts taxed not only paper products like the Stamp Act did, but it also taxed lead, paint, tea, and glass, all of these things that the colonists used all of the time. This time the colonists, the Americans, were so mad that they started to boycott British goods. They refused to buy goods that were made in Britain and sent to them. And another thing that happens as a result of the Townsend Acts that really upsets the colonists is something called writs of assistance. And writs of assistance basically gave tax collectors the right to go into colonists' homes and search for smuggled goods. However, they didn't have to have any evidence of smuggled goods. They could simply just decide they were going to go look for smuggled goods, knock on your door and say, I think you have smuggled goods in here. Go into your house and say, I think this is a smuggled good, and take it from you. And so this power that was given to tax collectors was abused quite a bit. This also led to the colonists being very, very upset. Remember one thing. From this point forward, whenever we talk about Americans or colonists, we're basically referring to the same thing. They were British colonists who were now calling themselves Americans. And when we get to 1776 and the Declaration of Independence, we'll officially have a United States of America. And then we'll just refer to them as Americans rather than colonists, because at that point, they'll no longer be associated with Great Britain. So bad British decision number 4 happens 1 year later in 1768. And the British are frustrated with all of the protests that the colonists are giving, the fact that they're boycotting their goods as a result of the Townsend Acts. And so the king sends troops to occupy Boston. Remember, Boston is where Sam Adams starts this radical group called the Sons of Liberty. And they've been kind of starting trouble here and there against the British. And so the king decides to send troops to occupy Boston. And this is a big mistake on the part of the British, because when the soldiers arrive, the colonists or the Americans are very resentful of it. And instead of keeping the peace in Boston, it raises the tension level, and things get out of hand. 2 years after the soldiers arrive in 1770, something called the Boston Massacre happens. And the details of what actually happened at the Boston Massacre, really we're not 100% sure. But it seems like what happened was that soldiers were on duty, and some young boys were teasing them and antagonizing them by throwing snowballs at them and possibly oyster shells. And eventually one of the British soldiers gets hit in the face with one of these oyster shells and falls down. And when he falls down, his gun accidentally discharges. The other soldiers believe that he has fired into the crowd, and some more firing happens, and eventually 5 colonists are killed in what becomes known as the Boston Massacre. Again, the details we're not 100% sure of, but what happens is, whether it was accidental or on purpose, 5 colonists end up being killed. And the colonists go into a frenzy over this. In fact, Sam Adams and Paul Revere used the Boston Massacre as a propaganda piece. And the painting that you can see here is one that Paul Revere took from another person and was able to use this as a propaganda piece showing the British soldiers firing unprovoked into the crowd, and you see the people being killed here on the ground. Well, in reality, it probably didn't look very much like this, but the Sam Adams and Paul Revere used this as a chance to use propaganda against the British. And this actually gives us a minute to talk about propaganda. Understand that propaganda is still around today. Propaganda is any time that you only present one side of a story or one side of an argument. And so an example of propaganda that we have today would be commercials on TV or advertisements in a magazine or on Facebook or on Twitter. Anytime that you see an advertisement, that advertisement for that product is only going to tell you the best things about that product. They're never going to tell you the bad things about that product in those advertisements because they want you to buy it. And so that is a form of propaganda that's still used today. So back to 1770 and the Boston Massacre, the soldiers that were involved with the massacre are put on trial for murder in Boston. And they are represented by a lawyer in Boston named John Adams. Now, John Adams, if you've never heard of him before, would end up going on to become our second president. And John Adams instantly becomes one of the most hated men in Boston because he represents these soldiers that are put on trial. Most of the people of Boston want them to be found guilty and sentenced to death. However, Adams realizes pretty quickly that they are not guilty of anything. At most, they're guilty of involuntary manslaughter or accidentally killing someone. But really, he believes that they were acting in self-defense because these boys and eventually a mob were throwing things at them and antagonizing them. So the trial goes on, and eventually the soldiers are in fact found not guilty of the murders of these 5 people. That was bad British decision number 4. Now we have 2 more bad British decisions to look at. The first one is bad British decision number 5, which is the Tea Act of 1773. So we're 3 years after the massacre, and the British, again, the king is just still trying to find ways to get money, to recuperate money from his the money that he had to pay out as part of the war, the French and Indian War from 1754 to 1763. And so he's still looking for ways that he can recuperate some of that money, and he wants to tax the colonists, and this is what he comes up with. The Tea Act was a very small tax on cheap tea. But what it did, it wasn't a huge tax, but what it did was it eliminated choice for the people of Boston and the colonists in general, all 13 colonies, because it forced them to buy this cheap British tea, which was not at the same quality as what they liked. It basically created a monopoly for the British on tea. And the colonists were not happy about this at all, and they tried to boycott it. And eventually what happens is in 1773, the colonists in Boston, they sneak on to 3 ships that are in the harbor, in Boston Harbor, filled with tea, that they refuse to let it be, the tea be unloaded. And so the tea is on these ships, and at night they dress up like Native Americans. They sneak on to these 3 ships, and they throw all of the tea into the harbor. And this week you're going to read a primary source of someone that was there at the Boston Tea Party, and you'll get to see some of the details about what was going through their minds and what they were thinking about as they were throwing this tea in the harbor. But the bottom line is they ruined somewhere around, in today's money, $4 million worth of tea that they throw away that cost the king a lot of money. And this bad British decision number 5 by the king ends up leading to the Tea Party, where the colonists destroy the tea. But the colonists destroying the tea really infuriated the king and would lead to bad British decision number 6. And bad British decision number 6 was called the Intolerable Acts of 1774. And these did 4 things that really basically set the colonists into motion to start a revolution, and eventually would lead to the United States of America. And the first thing that they did, the king was so furious about the Boston Tea Party that he issues these intolerable acts. And the first thing they did was the king said, I'm going to punish the people of Boston for the Tea Party. So he closed Boston Harbor. He sealed it off with his Navy ships, and nobody could get into the harbor and nobody could get out of the harbor. And this meant that all of the goods that would come into Boston were shut down, so people were not unable to get the things that they needed. It also meant that people that made things and grew things that they sold and shipped out of the harbor to send to other places to make money, they couldn't do that either. And so the harbor being closed caused a lot of trouble, for colonists. Another thing that he did was he sent more troops, and he started the Quartering Act. And the Quartering Act said that you, as a civilian in Boston, you would be forced to house soldiers in your house. You would have to feed them, you'd have to provide a place for them to sleep, and you had no other choice in the matter. If you refused, you would be arrested. And so the Quartering Act really was an inconvenience and a frustration for colonists as well. The Quebec Act basically took some area in the modern day Quebec and gave it to kind of change the boundary lines between New York and British Quebec. That wasn't that big of a deal, but it was part of the Intolerable Acts. And then finally, royal officials would be tried in Great Britain rather than in the Americas. Now, what does this mean, and why would this make colonists upset? Well, it would make colonists upset because if a royal official was accused of a crime in the Americas and they were put on trial in the Americas, the chances of them getting away with their crime would be much less. But if they were sent back to Great Britain to stand trial, they had a much better chance of getting a biased jury in their favor in Great Britain. If they were in the colonies, they would have a much better chance of getting a biased jury against them. And so this also made the colonists extremely upset. Well, all 6 of these bad British decisions would eventually lead to the American Revolution. And next week, we'll begin to look at some of the specifics of the early part of the American Revolution, like the Declaration of Independence and some things like that. But for this week, we just focus on these causes of the American Revolution. So at this point, you can go ahead and stop the video, and you can take your quiz that goes along with this Prezi.